The wind came first, sliding low across the frozen valley like a restless spirit, carrying sharp snow that stung against skin and clung to lashes. Nayati Blackthorn moved through it without flinching, his bare chest steaming against the storm's bite, the dark braids of his hair stiff with frost. The world was white and hushed, the silence broken only by the crunch of his moccasins and the slow, steady pull of his breath. He had walked this path many winters, but that day the snow carried a sound unlike any other, a muffled plea, thin and broken, buried somewhere ahead. At first he thought it a trick of wind through timbers, the way storms sometimes spoke in voices of the dead. But again, faint and ragged, it came. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." The sound clutched at his chest in a way no cold ever had. He slowed, head tilted, listening deeper than to any coyote's call or owl's warning. Beneath a drift near the station's collapsed freight platform, a burlap sack shuddered. Snow crusted its seams, and the shape inside shifted feebly. Nayati's steps grew deliberate. He crouched, his shadow falling broad across the sack, steam rising from his shoulders as though the storm itself bent around him. He touched the fabric, coarse and damp, and felt the fragile stir of life beneath. The voice quivered again, weaker now. "Help me!" For a moment he did not move. The old laws of his people, the bitter lessons of this land, told him that what townsfolk discard is never meant to be saved. Yet another voice, buried deep in the marrow of him, whispered otherwise. With a sharp tug, he loosened the knot. Snow spilled inside as he ripped the sack open. What tumbled out was not the refuse of freight or unwanted goods, but a woman, young, her face blue at the lips, hair damp and tangled across her cheeks. Her prairie dress was torn, thin fabric soaked and stiff. Her hands groped the air, clutching, and when his arms steadied her, she collapsed against him with the last of her strength. Nayati froze, not from the cold but from the sight of her eyes opening, wide and desperate, yet holding a fragile spark. She whispered hoarsely, "They left me." Her body shook as though the snow had seeped into her bones. He did not speak. Words had never been his way. His silence was the only strength he trusted. He gathered her as one might cradle a wounded bird, lifting her against the heat of his skin, and rose. The storm thickened, pressing its white veil across the abandoned tracks. The old station stood skeletal, its sign hanging crooked, timbers groaning under ice. No lanterns lit its windows. Nayati carried the woman past it without pause, his strides unbroken. She stirred faintly, her breath shallow, her lashes rimmed with frost. "Don't leave me there," she whispered. He looked down, his dark eyes unreadable, and tightened his hold. By the time he reached his cabin on the ridge, night had begun to bleed into the storm. Smoke from the roof hole was faint, nearly smothered by snow, but the fire within still breathed. He kicked the door open with the heel of his boot, ducked inside, and set her gently upon the buffalo hide spread near the hearth. The room glowed amber, heat wrapping the silence. She gasped at the sudden warmth, her chest rising in shallow waves. Nayati crouched beside her, his hand hovering above her shoulder, but never quite touching. He studied her face, pale, delicate yet marked with bruises. She seemed both young and old, fragile yet made of something that had endured much. Her eyes fluttered open, catching the firelight, and she forced a whisper. "Names. Sophia Bell." Then her gaze drifted, the effort of breath pulling her toward sleep. He stirred the fire higher, placed water to boil, and draped his only spare blanket across her shivering frame. He said nothing, but his silence was not empty. It was the quiet of a man weighing what the storm had delivered to his door. The night deepened, and with it came Sophia's restless murmurs. In half-dream, she spoke as though confessing to the walls. "They said I was cursed, said I'd only bring shame, so they bound me, left me like freight." Each word trembled, the pain too old to belong only to that night. Nayati listened, his jaw set, his breath slow. He did not interrupt. The fire cracked in answer, sparks rising as though to guard her words. Her breathing steadied, though ragged still. For the first time she slept without struggling. Nayati watched, unmoving, the storm raging against the shutters like a beast kept at bay. In her face he saw not just abandonment, but the ghost of all he had lost himself. The snow outside whispered of graves, of winters where voices went silent. His chest rose heavy, as though carrying a weight too familiar. When the flames sank low, he rose, gathering more wood. As he stepped toward the door, a sound made him stop. A faint, pitiful cry, not from Sophia but from outside. He stiffened, every instinct sharpened. The cry came again, muffled, fragile as a sparrow's chirp in frost. He pulled the door open, snow rushing in, and the wind carried the sound clearer. Another sack, half buried against the drift by the stoop, smaller than the first. Nayati's heart thudded once, hard and deep. He knelt, hands swift now, and dragged it inside. The fabric was soaked, brittle with ice. When he tore it open, a small boy's face appeared. Pale, lips trembling, eyes wide with fear though too weak to scream. The child's breath came in shudders, his tiny fists clutching air. Nayati stared, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. His gaze flicked from the boy to Sophia, sleeping fragile on the buffalo hide, her arm reaching unconsciously toward where the child now lay. The storm howled louder, as though sealing them all together in that fragile cabin. Nayati gathered the boy against him, heat meeting frail bones, and for the first time that night his silence broke, not in words, but in a long breath that shook with something beyond the storm. The boy's eyes blinked open, glimmering with faint trust. His small hand clutched Nayati's wrist, as though it were the only anchor left in a world determined to bury them all in snow. And in that moment, Nayati understood the storm had not simply delivered a stranger to his door. It had placed a choice upon his shoulders, one that would test not his strength, but his heart. Dawn came pale through the storm's thinning veil, the cabin windows glazed in frost, light bending like fractured glass across the wooden floor. Sophia stirred on the buffalo hide, her breath ragged but steadier than the night before. The blanket drawn over her smelled faintly of smoke and leather. For a moment, her gaze darted in confusion, then landed on the tall figure crouched near the fire, stirring coals with deliberate patience. Nayati's profile was sharp against the glow, eyes fixed on the embers as though he listened to secrets only flames could tell. Beside her the boy, Samuel, slept in a heavy stillness, his head nestled against a folded coat far too large for him. One small hand reached toward her, even in sleep, as if anchoring himself to the only thing left that would not vanish. Sophia's throat tightened at the sight, shame rising bitter as bile. She brushed her fingers lightly across his knuckles, whispering, "I'm sorry, my darling," though the apology reached far deeper than the boy could know. The silence in the cabin was not oppressive but weighted, full of words neither dared to speak. Sophia tried to lift herself, but the weakness of her lungs pressed her back. She turned her head, voice hoarse. "You should have left me there. Would have been easier." Nayati's gaze shifted from the fire to her, dark eyes unreadable. He did not answer, only added another log to the flames. His silence unnerved her. It carried neither pity nor judgment, but something steadier, heavier, as if her words held no power to sway him. He brought her a tin cup of broth, steam curling upward. When he set it into her trembling hands, his fingers brushed hers, rough with callus yet startlingly warm. She lowered her eyes. "You don't know what they said about me. About us." The broth burned faint on her tongue, but it was a fire she welcomed. "I wasn't worth keeping. Not worth a place on the train, nor a bed. Just shame, shame enough to be hidden away." Her voice faltered, curling inward as if every syllable came from a wound that had never closed. Nayati crouched again, wordless, watching her sip. His silence did not push her away. It left space for her confession to linger in the air, unchallenged. She swallowed another mouthful and whispered, "I thought the snow would finish what they started." Her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled the cup, and he steadied it, his large hand enveloping hers. For the first time she looked fully into his eyes. There was no mockery, no disgust, only a stillness that made her chest ache with the possibility that he did not see her as ruined. Hours drifted. Samuel woke with a cough, his small body curled against her. Nayati handed him a strip of dried meat softened in broth, and the boy accepted it shyly, his gaze darting between the man's towering frame and his mother's thin smile. Sophia smoothed Samuel's hair with trembling fingers, thinking of how fragile he looked, how easily the world could crush him. Shame lanced her again, sharp and unrelenting. She had failed him, failed to give him shelter, failed to keep him from hunger, failed to shield him from the cruelty that had cast them into sacks like discarded freight. She pressed her face against his hair, whispering promises she was not certain she could keep. Yet when she lifted her gaze, she caught Nayati carving something with his knife, wood shavings scattering at his feet. Samuel leaned closer, curiosity drawing him out of his shell. The shape emerged slowly under Nayati's deliberate hands, a small bird, wings outstretched. Without a word, he placed it into Samuel's palm. The boy's eyes widened with quiet wonder. Sophia's breath caught, struck by the gentleness hidden in such scarred hands. Later, when the boy slept again, Sophia's voice came low, as if testing fragile ground. "You'll not want us long. Folks never do. They see me, and all they see is a curse." Nayati did not raise his eyes from the fire. He spoke then, his voice deep, rough as stone yet steady. "Snow covers all tracks, but truth always waits beneath." The words startled her, for she had not expected him to answer at all. They carried no promise, yet something in them soothed the rawness inside her chest. The day passed in that rhythm, small gestures, quiet watching, shame gnawing at her while his silence shielded them both. Each time she tried to rise, he steadied her without question. Each time she faltered in breath, his eyes softened though his mouth stayed firm. She began to see that his restraint was not indifference, but a kind of reverence, as if he knew that some wounds required space more than speech. Outside, the storm eased, leaving the world wrapped in a cold hush. Snow lay heavy against the cabin walls, muffling every sound except the crackle of fire and Samuel's gentle breathing. For a fleeting heartbeat, Sophia felt safe, though safety had long been foreign to her. But shame lingered like a shadow, whispering that this peace could not last, that soon the world would remember them, and cast them out again. Evening fell. Sophia sat near the fire, Samuel curled at her side, when a sound drifted faintly through the frozen hush. Hoofbeats, distant but steady, carried by the snow. Her blood ran cold. She glanced toward the shuttered window, her heart hammering. Nayati had already stilled, his head lifted, listening. The rhythm of riders pressed closer, voices faint on the wind. Sophia clutched Samuel tighter, her whisper trembling. "They've come. They'll take him, they'll take me." Her voice broke, thick with terror, shame surging like a tide. She looked to Nayati, desperate, searching for refusal, for assurance, for anything. He rose to his full height, shadow filling the cabin, his gaze fixed on the door. The hoofbeats drew nearer, snow crunching under iron, voices sharpening into laughter and command. Sophia buried her face in Samuel's hair, breath trembling, knowing the world's judgment was at her door once more. And in the silence before the knock, she saw Nayati's hand reach for the latch, not to open and surrender, but to brace against whatever storm the town intended to unleash. The storm had broken, leaving the world draped in silence. Snow glittered like shards of glass across the valley, and smoke curled faint from chimneys below. Sophia leaned heavily on Nayati's arm as they descended into town, Samuel nestled against her hip. Each step sank into the drifts, the air still sharp with winter's bite. Though her strength had returned enough to walk, shame weighed heavier than the snow, pressing her eyes downward. She had been carried into this man's cabin half dead, her child hidden in a sack, and now she was to walk openly beside him beneath the gaze of those who had cast her away. The town came into view, hushed yet watchful. Boots crunched on planks, doors cracked open, whispers carried like brittle branches breaking. Nayati strode with the same steady rhythm he had kept through the blizzard, shoulders broad, braids dark against the pale sky. His silence was his shield, but Sophia felt every stare like a lash. Samuel whimpered and buried his face into her dress. She whispered promises she could not believe herself, her words trembling as if she feared they might shatter in the cold air. The general store stood ahead, its windows frosted, light flickering from lanterns within. Nayati pushed the door wide. The chatter inside stilled instantly, words freezing mid-breath. The warmth struck Sophia's face but brought no comfort. Abigail Turner stood by the counter, her bonnet sharp as a crow's beak, eyes narrowing to slits. "Well," she said, voice slicing through the silence, "the blizzard didn't clear the filth after all." Her words struck deeper than the cold, and Sophia's grip on Samuel faltered. Nayati did not flinch. He guided Sophia forward, each step deliberate, as if the floorboards themselves tested his resolve. The storekeeper's lips curled into disdain. "We don't deal in savages," he muttered, eyes sliding from Nayati to Sophia with contempt. "Or with their whores." Sophia's face burned crimson. Shame knifed through her, sharper than frostbite. She wanted to vanish into the floor, but Samuel's small hand clung to her sleeve, tethering her to the moment. Sophia lifted her chin despite the trembling of her lips. "I only need bread. For my boy." Her voice cracked, yet it held a fragment of dignity. The storekeeper sneered. "You've got nothing worth trading." He swept his hand dismissively, the gesture cold as the wind outside. Nayati's hand moved then, slow, deliberate. From his belt he drew his hunting knife, not raised, not threatening, but laid flat upon the counter. The blade gleamed silver in the lamplight, polished clean, reflecting every face in the room. A hush deepened. The storekeeper's smirk faltered. Abigail clucked her tongue sharply. "So this is the measure of you? Feeding off a heathen's scraps?" Her gaze skewered Sophia, who dropped her eyes in shame. The weight of judgment pressed like chains. Yet Sophia noticed something in the storekeeper's hands as he reached for the bread. Hesitation, respect grudgingly earned by the silent force of Nayati's presence. The loaf slid across the counter, heavy and warm. Sophia gathered it with trembling fingers, her heart pounding as though she had stolen rather than purchased. They left under a hail of whispers. Abigail's voice rose above them all. "It's an abomination, what you're doing. The Almighty won't suffer such unions." Sophia's cheeks burned hot, but she kept her gaze forward. Samuel pressed close. Nayati said nothing, but the set of his shoulders was iron, each step thudding like a verdict against the boards. Outside, the town square lay hushed under snow, though gossip swirled louder than wind. Silas Boone stood there, flanked by men whose rifles leaned casual but ready. His face was ruddy, a scar slashing across his cheek. "You've brought shame enough, Sophia Bell," he drawled, his voice loud enough for all windows to hear. "And now you crawl back with him? Better you stayed buried." Sophia's breath hitched. Her knees weakened, but Nayati's hand steadied her, strong and sure at her back. Silas sneered at the gesture. "He'll ruin you, girl. And the boy too. Town won't stand for it." The men behind him muttered agreement, their faces twisted with disdain. Sophia clutched Samuel tighter, every word confirming the truth she had feared. They would never be welcome, never be free of judgment. Yet in that moment she realized something. Samuel's small body leaned not away, but into Nayati's steadiness, as if drawn to his silence, his unshaken strength. Shame warred with a fragile flicker of hope. Sophia's voice wavered as she whispered to herself, "Why does he not leave us?" She dared a glance at Nayati's face. His jaw was set, eyes locked on Silas with a fire that required no words. In his silence, Sophia sensed defiance, a refusal to let their lives be dictated by those who would discard them. Silas stepped closer, snow crunching under his boots. "Hand her over. She doesn't belong to you. She doesn't belong anywhere." His words cracked through the square like a whip. Sophia closed her eyes, shame pressing heavy, the memory of the sack suffocating her again. Nayati shifted, placing himself between Silas and Sophia. His height loomed, bare chest scarred and unflinching against the winter air. He did not raise a hand, but the threat in his stillness was louder than any shouted challenge. Silas hesitated, his men uneasy at the quiet power before them. For a heartbeat, even Abigail fell silent in her doorway, lips pressed thin. The tension stretched, brittle as ice. Then Nayati reached down, not to his knife, but to Samuel's small hand. The boy blinked up at him, eyes wide, and clasped the giant's fingers with all the trust of a child who had seen the world's cruelty, and still believed in the warmth of one man's silence. The square drew breath, the gesture speaking louder than any argument. Sophia's heart trembled. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her, a faint ember stirring in the ashes of her shame. She saw the boy's hand in Nayati's, and she realized that dignity was not something granted by townsfolk's whispers, but something claimed in the face of them. The silence shattered when Sophia's body buckled, breath rasping sudden and harsh. Her knees gave way, the world spinning. The sickness she had carried since the sack's suffocation rose like a tide. Nayati caught her before she struck the snow, his arms steady, his face unreadable but fierce. The crowd gasped, whispers turning sharp. Silas stepped back, uncertain, his sneer faltering. Abigail's hand rose to her mouth, her eyes darting with unease. Nayati gathered Sophia against him, lifting her as though she weighed no more than snow itself. Samuel clung to his side, tears streaking his cheeks. Without a word, Nayati turned from the crowd and strode toward the ridge, the town's judgment trailing like a storm at his back. And as the door to the cabin closed behind them, the wind carried Silas Boone's final hiss across the snow. "She won't last the winter." Snow fell like a ceaseless curtain, thick and relentless, blotting out the valley, until the world seemed to vanish beyond the cabin walls. The blizzard came sudden and merciless, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to test what fragile life clung to the ridge. Nayati moved through the dim cabin with the gravity of a man who knew storms could devour as swiftly as wolves. His hands pressed herbs into a steaming cup, his dark eyes fixed on the frail rise and fall of Sophia's chest. She lay beneath blankets, lips pale, each breath a shallow rasp. The illness had taken root, seated in the damp suffocation of that sack, and watered by shame, until it threatened to claim her altogether. Samuel slept curled at her side, his small face damp with tears he would not shed while awake. Each time his chest lifted, Nayati's shoulders eased fractionally, as though the boy's breath lent rhythm to his own. When Sophia stirred, her eyes glimmered fever-bright in the firelight. She tried to sit, but her strength betrayed her, and she sank back with a soft cry. Don't let them take him," she whispered, voice cracking with the force of a mother's terror. Nayati knelt beside her, pressing the cup to her lips. She drank with trembling hands, the bitter brew spilling down her chin. "I've nothing left to give," she murmured. "Nothing but shame." His silence stretched, steady and deep, until she turned her face away in despair. Then, slowly, he reached out and brushed the wet from her lips with the back of his hand. The gesture was tender yet unflinching, as though he had touched wounds before and understood they could scar without defining. The hours passed heavy. Wind howled like spirits clawing at the door, snow piling high against the shutters. Nayati fed the fire with careful patience, breaking the silence only with the crack of wood. Sophia drifted between fever dreams, whispering fragments of her past, of cruel words, of being told she was cursed, of nights spent hiding Samuel from fists and jeers. Each word carved a hollow in the air. Nayati listened, unmoving, his stillness a vessel that carried her confessions without judgment. When her voice broke altogether, Samuel awoke with a start. He reached for her weak hand and then, hesitantly, for Nayati's. His small palm pressed against the man's scarred knuckles, trusting without words. Something in that fragile weight softened the stone of Nayati's silence. He closed his hand gently, enclosing the boy's fingers in a promise unspoken. Sophia saw it through fevered haze and tears burned her eyes, not from sorrow but from the unbearable grace of it. The blizzard raged without pause. Time lost meaning. Hunger pressed in, yet Nayati seemed carved from endurance itself. He set traps beyond the cabin door, his form a shadow swallowed by snow, returning with meager rabbits and a fox stiff with frost. He worked without complaint, his bare chest steaming as he skinned the catch, fire crackling bright against the storm's roar. Each act was not survival alone, but a quiet vow that they would not be abandoned to winter's cruelty. Sophia's fever broke with the second dawn, her body drenched in sweat, her breath steadier though weak. She turned her face toward the fire, whispering, Why do you keep me here?" Her eyes searched his as though daring him to speak the truth she feared. Nayati held her gaze, his silence taut as a drawn bow. At last, he spoke, voice low and rough as river stone. "Because the snow buries lies. But it cannot bury truth." The words landed in her like warmth seeping into marrow. For the first time since her exile, she believed that perhaps she was not cursed, not beyond saving. A trembling smile touched her lips before exhaustion claimed her again. When she slept, Nayati stepped outside. The storm had calmed to a steady fall, the valley below swallowed in white silence. He stood bare to the snow, breath rising in plumes, and lifted his face to the sky. Scars traced his chest, each mark a memory of battles fought, of kin lost, of winters endured alone. Now another battle loomed, not of rifles or blades, but of a town's judgment and the fragile life he had taken into his keeping. The blizzard waned by the third day. The world emerged hushed and crystalline, trees bowed beneath snow's heavy hand. Sophia sat propped near the fire, her face color returning. Samuel curled against her lap with the carved bird clutched tightly in his fist. She looked up at Nayati as he entered, her lips parting with something like awe. "You carried us through," she whispered. He said nothing, only set fresh wood to the flames, yet his eyes lingered on her longer than before. The fragile peace was broken by the distant echo of hooves. Nayati stiffened, head turning toward the sound. Sophia's face drained of color, her body trembling. "It's them," she whispered, clutching Samuel close. The boy stirred, eyes wide with fear, the bird falling from his hand onto the floorboards. Voices carried on the cold air, rough and certain, each word striking like stone. Men calling Nayati's name, demanding the woman be returned, demanding the child. The town had not forgotten, nor forgiven. The blizzard had not swept away their judgment, it had only delayed it. Sophia pressed her forehead to Samuel's hair, her whisper breaking apart. "They'll take us. They'll tear us away." Her eyes lifted to Nayati, desperate. He stood at the door, massive frame filling its frame, scars lit by the fire's glow, snow swirling beyond him like a curtain of ghosts. For the first time since the storm began, his voice rose clear and steady, not to soothe, but to declare. "No one takes what the storm has spared." His hand closed around the latch, bracing for the weight that pressed from the other side. The hoofbeats grew louder, the voices sharper, the snow trembling with their advance. Sophia's heart pounded in her ears, Samuel's cries muffled against her dress. And as the door shuddered with the first heavy knock, the silence inside broke, not with fear, but with the promise of a stand that could not be turned aside. The door rattled beneath the fists that pounded against it, each strike echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. Sophia clutched Samuel close, her breath ragged, her face pressed into his hair as if to shield him from a world that had already proven merciless. The boy whimpered, his small body trembling, but his hand reached instinctively toward Nayati, fingers stretching for the strength that loomed steady by the door. Nayati's scarred hand closed around the latch, his silence holding the room as if even the storm outside bowed to it. The door flew open beneath his strength, snow swirling inside in a wild rush. Silas Boone stood at the threshold, flanked by men whose rifles glinted dull in the pale light. Their breath steamed, their eyes narrow with disdain. Silas's sneer curled into the room like poison. "Hand her over, Apache. The woman and the boy. You've no right to them. Town won't abide this shame." Sophia stiffened, shame pressing heavy as stone, her pulse a wild drum in her ears. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the snow, but Samuel's grip bound her to the moment. Nayati stepped forward, broad chest bare against the cold, scars crossing his skin like maps of battles survived. He did not reach for weapon or shield. He stood unarmed, unyielding, a wall of silence. Silas spat into the snow. "You think standing there makes you a man? You think silence makes you noble? You're filth. And she's worse for siding with you." His gaze cut toward Sophia, and the crowd murmured in agreement. Sophia's breath caught, shame burning her cheeks. Her body curled inward, as though each word struck like a lash. She felt the old curse coil in her heart again, the certainty that she was unworthy, doomed to rejection. But then she looked at Samuel. His small hand still clung to Nayati's fingers, his eyes wide but unafraid, trust radiating from him like fragile light. Sophia's chest tightened. She saw it. The boy did not see disgrace in Nayati's silence. He saw safety. He saw a father where the world saw only an outcast. Something broke within her. Broke and then shifted. Sophia straightened, shame trembling but refusing to drown her any longer. She rose to her feet, Samuel still in her arms, her voice shaking but clear. "No," she whispered, then louder, steadier. "No. You will not take us." Silas barked a laugh. You've no say, girl. You belong nowhere. Her lips trembled, but she lifted her chin. I belong here. With him. And my son belongs with the only man who has not thrown us away. Her words trembled in the air, fragile yet unbreakable. Gasps shivered through the gathered men. Abigail Turner, standing further back in her bonnet, clutched her shawl tighter, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. Silas's face reddened with fury. He raised his rifle, the metal glinting sharp. The crowd shifted, uncertain, their murmurs faltering. Nayati did not move from his place, though the rifle pointed at his chest. His silence spoke louder than any threat. A man who had endured storms, loss, and exile would not bend to this moment. Sophia stepped closer to him, her hand trembling as it slid into his. Her fingers, fragile and bruised, folded into his scarred palm. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver through the crowd. To touch him so openly, to claim him before all, shame transfigured into defiance. Samuel, emboldened by her courage, lifted his voice, thin but piercing. He's my father now. The boy's desafiation cracked across the snowy square, echoing like a bell. Silence followed, heavy, absolute. The men faltered, shifting uncomfortably. Abigail's lips parted, her sharp tongue still for once. Marshal Crane, who had watched from behind the crowd, lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes narrowing with thought. The storm that had seemed ready to break suddenly hesitated, teetering on the edge of surrender. Silas snarled, stepping forward. This is madness. You can't let. But his words fell flat against the silence, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Nayati's gaze burned into him, unblinking, steady as a mountain. He took one step forward, the snow crunching beneath him, his massive frame looming. Silas, for all his bluster, faltered, his grip on the rifle unsteady. Go home, Boone, Marshal Crane said at last, his voice firm, carrying the weight of law. No blood will be spilled over gossip. The crowd shifted, their anger dissolving into mutters, their faces uneasy. Abigail's eyes softened, just for a breath, before she turned away. One by one, the men began to retreat, their boots crunching through the snow. Silas stood rigid, face twisted in fury, but without his men he was hollow. He spat once more at the ground, then turned sharply, his coat whipping behind him as he stormed into the fading snow. The square emptied, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind. Sophia sagged against Nayati, breath trembling, tears streaking her face. Shame still lingered, but it had been met with something new. Dignity, fragile yet real, earned in the face of the world's scorn. Nayati's hand closed gently around hers, steady and sure. She looked up at him, searching his eyes. For the first time, she did not see silence as absence but as promise, an anchor that would not let her drift. You didn't let them take us, she whispered. He inclined his head, the faintest shadow of warmth flickering across his face. Samuel, still clutching his carved bird, nestled between them, his small body safe at last. The snow began to fall again, softer now, as though the storm itself had gentled. The world held its breath, the hush of winter wrapping them in fragile peace. Sophia's heart throbbed with a strange, trembling hope, that perhaps she was not cursed, not destined for rejection, but had found a place where her shame could thaw into something new. Then came the sound again, faint but certain. Hoofbeats, separate from the ones that had departed, approaching with purpose. Sophia's breath caught, her body stiffening. Nayati turned his head, his jaw tightening. The storm had not ended after all, it had only shifted. Whatever came next would test not just their dignity, but their survival.